And I'm Joe Agayo. It is exactly 1 week to the general election on March 4th. And tonight we'll be hearing again from the 8 presidential candidates on the issues that matter to you, the Kenyan voter, the economy, as well as land and natural resources.
The live audience here at Brookhouse International School has agreed to remain silent. No jeering and no cheering during the debate. The only exception will be now as we welcome the candidates to the podium. The candidates are joining us in the order of a ballot carried out earlier. First to get onto the podium will be Professor James Ole Kiapi of the Restore and Build Kenya, or RBK party.
Next on stage, Musalia Mudavadi of the UDF, United Democratic Forum Party.
Next up is Paul Mwite of Safina.
The next presidential candidate on stage, Martha Karua of NARC Kenya.
The presidential flag bearer for the Orange Democratic Movement, Raila Odinga.
The next candidate on stage will be Mohamed Abduba Dida of the Alliance for Real Change.
Making his way into the auditorium next will be Uhuru Kenyatta of the National Alliance, or TNA.
And completing the list of 8, Peter Kenneth of the Kenya National Congress.
Welcome back to the Kenya presidential debate, ladies and gentlemen. Shall we all rise for the national anthem led this evening by Kabutha Mwanzia Asio.
Natika
Let's all be seated, and candidates, please take your positions behind your respective podiums. Well, this is the first segment of the evening that is going to be on the economy, and that will be driven by my co-moderator, Uduak Amemo.
Thank you, Joe. As before, we've received thousands of questions from the public, but ultimately the questions are our own. I haven't seen Joe's questions, and he hasn't seen mine. So again, as before, you have 2 minutes to respond to questions and 30 seconds for rebuttals. You have a timer in front of you to help you manage your time, but I'll also stop you when your time is up. I'll also remind you that you've agreed to address each other respectfully and to keep your language civil. So we're dealing with the economy, and the first question centers on the minimum wage. I'll start with you, Professor Kiapi, in the order of entry. What do you think the minimum wage in Kenya should be?
Minimum wage is, of course, a factor of the economic conditions of the country. It is a factor of the labor itself, and it's also a function of the employers and the negotiation between the government and the trade unions. And therefore, when you are saying or setting a minimum wage, you must bring all these factors into consideration. So it is not a matter about saying this is the level, exactly this. It is a matter about structuring labor in the country. Because in Kenya today, you have every now and then one sector of the economy demanding a wage and another sector of the economy demanding an increase, and that is pointing to a much more serious problem. And the more serious problem is that the labor is not commensurate. There are disparities. And therefore, what I would like to do when I'm president is to engage as government and employers and the trade unions to really look at a sustainable manner in which we can appropriate labor in the country. So how much we will use and how much we shall set must depend on the economy at that time, the prevailing conditions, and it must be negotiated so that you also must ensure there is stability. Because labor unrest from time to time can also be not useful and not good for economic growth. So I think what has been missing is a structured engagement that brings all the stakeholders together. And this is my commitment to the Kenyan people and especially the employers, that our biggest capital, our number one resource is the human capital or the labor. But we need to make sure that that labor is properly structured and managed in order to arrive at levels that are sustainable.
Your time is up. Ms. Karua, I'll come to you because Professor Kiapi touched on labor and rest. And so Kenya currently ranks as one of the countries that has the unfortunate distinction of being one of the most unequal. So we have a minimum wage at about 8,000 shillings, and for some people it's 500 shillings a day. What do you think the minimum wage should be? Yes.
All over the world, the talk now is not about minimum wage. It's about livable wage. And that is what the ILO standards demand. Therefore, it is a question of having strong labor movement, creating an enabling environment for labor movement to thrive so that they can have the strength to negotiate with the industry, and seeing the labor movement as a partner. My government will have a partnership with the labor movement, will encourage industry to partner with labor. When you have livable wages for workers, industry also benefits. Healthy workers are able to be more productive. So it's for the benefit of the country, the benefit of the economy, and wages also depend on how much the government is putting in terms of other public services. My government will give universal health care, what we are calling cradle to grave, free education from nursery, primary to secondary. This again takes away the burden of the cost, some of the cost of living away from the worker. So a combined effort by government, how we spend our tax money, and industry also investing a little bit more in the workers. The industry makes profit, the workers are happy and are able to produce more. That's what I would do.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Odinga, we've heard two candidates now talk about engaging with labor. We've heard a livable wage brought into the discussion. What do you think the lowest, the least, what is the least wage a Kenyan should earn? Given that people in your class of leaders earn more than $10,000 a month?
Well, we talk of the living wage. That is a wage that will enable somebody to live a decent life. And you look at the shopping basket, the cost of living in the country, the cost of transport, the cost of the rent, the cost of things like the food and so on. So that is what it should be. Now, we need to have a dialogue, a tripartite arrangement where you have got the unions, the employer, and the government talking about this so that we really know what is the cost of living in the country today and what should it be. And that is what should determine what should be the living wage, a minimum wage in the country, so that there's harmony. Because you must know that for us to be able to grow, we must be competitive in the international labor market. If, for example, the wages are too high in our economy, of course we price ourselves out of that market. So we must look at the causative factors. What is it that makes the unions demand 300% pay rise? The teachers, the nurses, the doctors, the lecturers, and so on. So we need to have a dialogue to be able to determine that.
I'll just interrupt you there to ask you, do you not know what the cost of living is in Kenya at the moment?
No, we know what it is, but it is not static. The cost of living keeps on changing. Like, for example, if the price of oil goes up, it will go up tomorrow. The cost of transport will go up. Matatu used to cost 30 shillings from Dandora into town. Today it is 50 shillings. A packet of milk was 25 shillings, now it is 45. Unga was, for example, 70, it is now 120. So we will need dialogue so that we can agree on what really is a living wage for the worker in the country.
Mr. Dida, do you have any thoughts on the minimum wage? What do you think it should be? Minimum or living wage, if you will?
Well, due to economic inequality is why 90% of Kenyans are marginalized economically. And I'm hearing a dialogue, and the nurses are still on the road. What they need is always on posters in the road. This is my house rent, this is this, this is this. They sing this, and it had happened. What we need is to clearly explain to everybody that nobody is super Kenyan. Nobody is super. Whether the president or the security. It is unfair for a Kenyan to earn a gross salary, of 8,000, while a leader is earning, leave the salary, an entertainment allowance of $500,000. It is unfair. And it is shocking because the commission that was appointed to look into this is also, maybe circumference and nearness to the palace is one thing that is affecting most of us. My government will not accept the figures that were given, and what I propose is a formula. Which formula do we use as Kenyans to pay these wages? It is the formula that matters. If we will base ourselves on payment following education, is a formula, and everybody is contented. But we don't understand, I don't understand, and any human being does not understand why somebody should be paid 2 million and another one 5,000. So what I will encourage and what my government will advocate is equity for everybody. Nobody is super and nobody is a nugu. We are all the same. We have the same stomach, we have the same children and everything. The leaders need is what the citizens need.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dida. Mr. Kenyatta, you've been the Minister of Finance, and Mr. Dida was talking about the inequalities in Kenya, the salary disparities. And I'll take you back to 1972, when the International Labour Organization recommended a salary freeze for Kenya's top income earners. What do you think is a livable wage for Kenyans, and would your government freeze the salaries of its top income earners?
I think the most important thing to recognize is that the cost or the minimum wage, the living cost, is not something that you can say is a fixed cost, because it depends on overall the cost of living. What we need to ensure is that we have a wage that ensures that people have a decent living, but at the same time, a minimum wage that ensures that also as a nation, we remain competitive. And that is why we, in the Jubilee Coalition, are actually focusing not just on the wage bill itself, but to actually just say that we need to really focus ourselves, especially when it comes to agriculture, reducing the cost of agriculture, making food much more affordable, looking at housing. How can we make the cost of building our houses that much cheaper so that the rents can come down? Because at the end of the day, that wage is supposed to ensure that every individual in Kenya who is employed has a decent life. That can only come once we ensure that we also are maintaining the prices of our foodstuffs, telecommunications, and so on and so forth at a level where we don't have to consistently push the wage bill up in order to allow people to survive. That said and done, we must also recognize that as politicians and as leaders, we do have a moral responsibility as well to ensure that these kind of heavy salary increases that we consistently give ourselves as politicians don't actually happen. I want to remind Kenyans that when I was, during my tenure as the Minister of Finance, I was under intense pressure from members of Parliament on this issue of increasing salaries. And in fact, our finance bill was very late because I actually rejected that. And I told them that it's actually not possible for us to be able to award ourselves these huge increases while at the same time expecting the average Kenyan to live on the kind of salary wage he has.
Mr. Kenneth, we've heard about the huge wage bill in Kenya at the moment, which I believe for the leadership, the government wage bill is 8% of our GDP. Our leadership size is also comparable to the US, although their population is 10 times more than ours. So how would you address this income disparity in Kenya?
I think first of all, with the Constitution, we need to implement the issues to do with salaries and remuneration commission so that we can have basic standards within government officers, and this would be across the board. I am happy that they have seen it wise to reduce, and they should be encouraged to reduce further so that we can save the government from such a huge wage bill that needs to go to basic services. When we talk about cost of living is one up because basic services are not there. So if you get your 8,000 shillings, you still have to cater for yourself from a medical point. The transport system is not there. You have to secure yourself. And sometimes then you find that you have been left with nothing to take home. Now, in assessing what the minimum wage bill should be, it is important to review what the rate of inflation is. It is also important to cushion Kenyans against factors that are external. We need to think of how we can cushion Kenyans against, for example, when oil goes up, our food prices go up. We need to cushion Kenyans when the dollar goes up, appreciates against the shilling. Then because we are a net importer, we are left with no choice but to increase. And I sympathize with the ordinary worker because they are really suffering. But we also need to expand our economy to create opportunities, because at the moment also our workers have been reduced to compete for fewer opportunities in the market. And therefore, the issue of the minimum wage bill becomes more or less compulsory. But if they had opportunities, they would be in a position to venture into other areas of employment within opportunities that have been created within the labor market.
Thank you, Mr. Kenneth. Mr. Mwiti, I'll come to you because so far from the candidates, we haven't really heard any specifics about what the lowest a Kenyan should be, what the lowest salary should be for a Kenyan. Yet we all know what Kenya's top income earners make, those of you in leadership. So can you tell us what you think the least a Kenyan should earn is?
First of all, let's look at the statistics. The World Bank places Kenya at number 171. Only 27 nations are behind Kenya in terms of poverty, measured on the basis of the GDP. We're talking about a country, Kenya, where the GDP is $286 per annum, works out at 24,000 shillings per year. We're talking about a situation if we were to distribute our wealth equally, each Kenyan would be getting 2,000 shillings per month. Works out at about 66 shillings per day. The cost of 2 kg portion meal, unga, which is why they talk about the unga revolution, is 140 shillings. So these are the statistics that we should be looking at. What is the rationale when you are fixing the minimum age? It should be a wage that is able to give a Kenyan a decent living. But where is it going to come from? I see a disconnect, for example, between taxation policies, particularly with regard to small-scale businesses and medium-scale businesses. Because as we tax businesses, we need to nurture those businesses so that they can produce more, so that what you are taxing them can be more. Because there is a limit to what the businesses can afford. I mean, when you talk about the minimum wage, the lowest paid are domestic workers and agricultural workers. And yet, what they are paid is not enough to give them a decent living. On the other hand, there are constraints on the employers. So we need to harmonize, we need to rationalize. The bottom line is that we must make our economy grow. We must come up with policies that nurture businesses. We must aim to export more than we import.
Your time is up.
Thank you.
Mr. Mudavadi, I'll come to you because we're hearing about addressing the economic system, providing social services, making sure that, reducing the burdens on the average Kenyan worker. Do you think, perhaps that there should be a minimum wage or not? And we've also heard two of your rivals talk about minimizing the wage bill. But the question flowing from all of this is the cost of our leadership. If we talk about where the money for a minimum wage will come from, surely it will come from, the leadership and reducing the costs that you and your colleagues are incurring on our behalf.
Yeah, I would like to make one observation, and this is that clearly Kenya does not have a good wage policy. We have not reviewed our wage policy on a serious note for a very long time. We have lived with what we more or less had at the very beginning, and it has not been reviewed, bearing in mind that now we have a more open, a more market-oriented economy. So this is one thing that I would immediately pull all the stakeholders together so that we can review appropriately the wage policy. The second point I would just want to point out is that clearly the 8,000 shillings is not sustainable in the long run. Right now, every Kenyan, particularly the poor Kenyan, spends up to about 70% of their resources on food alone. Not shelter yet, not on other items yet, but just food alone. Now, clearly, if we want to help the Kenyan people and make them have a truly living wage, then we must institute certain measures. We must make sure that agriculture can expand so that food can be cheaper. We must tackle aspects of energy production because these are matters that go into a lot of production, and that would help in easing the cost of production and as a consequence be able to help Kenyans meet their daily lives. One other thing that is serious is the cost of fuel. I've talked of electricity, but the cost of fuel is so prohibitive. Right now, the common man spends almost 100 shillings a litre on kerosene, which they use for cooking. Now, we have had people talking about reducing overall rates of fuel in other areas. But if you target a blanket aspect, you'll not be helping the poor. So one of the things that I would really do is to continuously focus on areas of mitigating against the pressure that the poor are facing.
Okay, your time is up. So just a quick follow-up. Would you recommend, would you freeze the salaries of the top 10% as the ILO recommended in 1972?
I think we have to bear in mind that
30 seconds for that.
We have to bear in mind that 1972 is way back. But with a clear wage policy, we can rationalize the growth and the situation of Kenyan salary levels at this point in time. The Remuneration Commission is a good step in the right direction, but we must work quickly and have this policy adopted and even endorsed by Parliament as soon as possible, so that we can now move and remove the distortions in our economy.
Okay, Ms. Karua, would you freeze the salaries of the top 10%?
I think it's no longer necessary because we have an organ, a constitutional commission to do that. Not literally freeze, but harmonize the wages. I would give them full support, give them all the necessary backup they need from the civil service and from my government to ensure that they do their work within a reasonable time. I would also make other interventions that help to lessen the cost of living. I've already mentioned about health services and education.
Okay.
But also,
your time is up. Your time is up. Mr. Kenyatta, I asked you the question about the income freeze first. And since 1972, when that policy was recommended, the inequalities, the disparities in Kenya have grown significantly. Would you recommend a freeze for the top income earners?
I think I would recommend a freeze, and it's not necessarily a freeze, but we have to recognize that if we are to retain sanity in our financial management, especially as a government, we have to ensure that our public officers are paid a reasonable wage, but not a wage that at the end of the day pushes other salaries up because we have awarded our salaries that are not in line with any principle. It's just a question of sitting in Parliament and agreeing.
Thank you. Mr. Kenneth?
I think we need to be sensitive. We need to actually look at the higher perks that people earn, and also we need to think of how to bridge the gap. And for me, we need to create choices so that workers are not left with no choices. And the only way to deal with this is to give incentives to the economy to grow, so that workers can have the choice of selecting where they would like to go. Yes.
No freeze from you. Mr. Dida, what do you think?
My government will recommend not only a freeze, but an overpayment. They have to pay it back. Yeah. Because that injustice, why these commissions and why the new constitution is to be implemented, is just to come up with a healing process. And some of us have very huge debt, and this has to be, the only way is they pay it back.
Okay, back pay. Mr. Kiapi.
I will do three things. Number one, let us make sure there is equity by rationalizing salaries from the top and the bottom. Number two, we need to bake a bigger cake. It doesn't matter how much we argue. If it is the same, we will fight each other for nothing. Number three, let us make sure payment is based on productivity. If you do more, then we pay you more. Unlike now, where parliamentarians sit for 1 hour and you pay them 800,000, and teachers are teaching for 8 hours.
Your time is up.
Yes.
Mr. Mwite, would you freeze salaries?
Safina government would be sensitive to the outcry of the Kenyan people in terms of the salaries and allowances earned, for example, by members of parliament, ministers, PAs, and what have you, and therefore would make a very strong recommendation to the Salaries and Remuneration Commission to take those sensitivities into account and bring them down. Kenya is one of the most unequal nations on the earth, and a good starting point.
Your time is up. Thank you. Mr. Odinga, would you freeze salaries of the top income earners in Kenya?
For this economy to grow, we must reduce consumption. At the moment, the current expenditure is just too high. You're just consuming. We will actually recommend not just a freeze, but reduction. And I will begin with myself. I will have the pay of the president so that I can lead by example.
You will have to
others
pay.
Follow suit.
Okay, thank you very much. And we'll move on to the next set of questions, and these have to do with your personal economies, because you've all talked about addressing corruption. Sorry, we're moving on. We are addressing corruption now. You've all talked about it. And so I'm going to ask you about your records, because some of you, those of you who've been in public service for some time, are associated with certain events in our history which have been thrown up in your quest for leadership. And so, Mr. Mwite, I'll start with you.
Sure.
Because in the 90s, Kamlesh Patni alleged that he gave you a bribe of 20 million shillings. You told Parliament in April 1999 that you'd responded to the Law Society of Kenya on that matter. Can you please tell us what exactly took place, whether you accepted a bribe of 20 million shillings from Kamlesh Patni?
It is absolutely not true. I mean, what was happening in the 90s is that I and Professor Anyang' Nyong'o were the ones who broke out this issue of Golden Bag. The system then focused on me. And let me tell you, some of us have had to pay very high prices. At the personal level, it was a well-orchestrated campaign to silence me on the issue of Golden Bag. You will remember that the Commission of Inquiry by Bosire, despite whatever other shortcomings it may have had, their report was there, and Mr. Mwite wasn't mentioned. There is no truth in it. It may be possible that some individuals around me may have gone and gotten money from him on the basis that he was going to intervene, they were going to intervene. It isn't true. In fact, shortly after the time he says that he gave me that money, I was the lead counsel on behalf of the Law Society in mounting a private prosecution in the Golden Bag matter. So there isn't an iota of truth
to that. Let me just follow up on that, because yes, if I remember correctly, the Law Society then said they found that you or persons associated to you had accepted a check of 15 million shillings and cash in 5 million shillings. So for purposes of clarity, because we know what a drain corruption has been on this country, could you please clarify that for us?
That is what I said earlier. Individuals around me may have gotten money. Mr. Mwite did not get any money whatsoever. And in fact, Mr. Patni himself eventually accepted that he never gave me any money at all. And that is on record in the Bosire Judicial Commission of Inquiry.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, sir. Mr. Mudavadi, you're also linked to Goldenberg, and more recently in 2010 to a cemetery land scandal. You've been investigated in the case of the cemetery land scandal by Parliament. Could you just clarify these scandals and your role in them for us?
Let me start with the Goldenberg issue. The Goldenberg issue is an export compensation scheme and a pre-shipment scheme that was abused. And I was appointed to the Treasury in 1993 when the Goldenberg scheme was in force. So what did I do? I terminated it. And what were the steps that I took to terminate Goldenberg? First, I got Pricewaterhouse to set up a special audit on the transactions surrounding Goldenberg, which they did. Consequent to that, my time in Treasury, I was able to close several banks that were associated with the abuse of the pre-shipment and pre-export scheme. I got this out of the way. Many banks had to close. We even changed the law regarding the central bank vis-a-vis the question of what central bank can do and what it cannot do. The law was changed during my tenure, and this was to close the whole chapter of Goldenberg. I was subsequently also exonerated by the Bosire Commission, which was a public inquiry that went on for 3 years. Now, the second issue is the issue about the cemetery. This is a procurement issue at the City Council of Nairobi. They did not follow the procedure. They failed to follow the laid down procedure, and the matter was investigated. I personally wrote to the Anti-Corruption Authority, and I said this matter should be investigated. They did investigate. I was interrogated. They interrogated many other people, and after their findings, they took the matter to court, and that is where the matter rests now.
Right. Thank you very much for that. I just want to be clear. 2 parliamentary commissions investigated you, if I'm not mistaken, and one found you culpable and another cleared you. Could you just address the parliamentary investigations?
First of all, let's agree that Parliament has an oversight role. They did their investigations, but I want to state very clearly that I was not culpable and I stood my ground and I attended the sessions of both those committees and I maintain very clearly that I was not involved in any malpractice. Thank
you very much. Ms. Karu, I'll come to you because you say you're committed to the rule of law and to tackling corruption and impunity. I will then question your treatment of whistleblowers in this country because, of course, they have been the ones who've alerted us to corruption in the country. Yeah. Yet you, as Minister of Justice, have not put out any support for, say, John Githongo, David Munyake, or Naftali Langat.
May I say that I became Minister of Justice December 2005. If you remember, John Githongo announced he had left the country January of that year. So he was not around the country to demand or look for any protection. Munyake was earlier than I was Minister for Justice, and what I did during my time, the only witnesses who came to me were witnesses related to the Charterhouse Bank. I gave them full support within the ambit of the law at that time, and some of them eventually left the country. And even when their issues have come in Parliament, when they were being called names, I was the sole voice saying we should not trash whistleblowers.
Okay, I'll zero in on David Munyake because we know that unfortunately he died a couple of years ago. Have you or did you, while you were Minister of Justice, make any sort of overtures to his family? Have you made any sort of overtures to John Githongo? Because I remember correctly, if I remember correctly, you and your then Foreign Affairs counterpart, Raphael Tuju, and a couple of ministers held a press conference denouncing John Githongo when he went into exile, fearing for his life over Anglo leasing.
I do not think that there was a joint press conference denouncing him, maybe defending the government's position, because what had happened was that the Anglo leasing scandal came out. We did, as Minister of Justice, I printed in the newspapers the whole history of Anglo leasing, who was minister when, and also admitting that it did come up during our time. And it was during my tenure that the Anti-Corruption Law, together with the Public Officers Ethics Act, for the first time did what it was supposed to do. On my recommendation, ministers stepped aside. Never mind that they never forgave me for having them step aside. And I have consistently pursued that line.
But in terms of looking after the actual whistleblowers themselves, you've never taken a personal interest in their...
In the sense that I've taken personal interest when they have come to me, like the Charterhouse Bank witnesses did. But for those who were abroad, honestly, how would I look
David
after
Munyake
them?
was not abroad.
David
Neither was
Munyake, his matter was an old matter, and there was no scheme to support what he needed, because he came to my office once when I was Minister for Justice. He needed support, financial support. My office did not have any such.
Okay,
whatever.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Time is up.
Yeah.
Mr. Odinga, you've been in public service for a while, and so you are associated with several scandals. We have the urban food subsidy program. There's the Kazi kwa Vijana. So a whole raft of ambitious programs originating from the office of the Prime Minister that have unfortunate ends. Could you please clarify this for the sake of our viewers?
Well, the Kazi kwa Vijana project was basically a project that we conceived in very good faith to try to cushion the youth at a time when the economy was really very bad. It was intended to put money into the pocket of the youth at that time through projects like road construction, construction of dams and water ponds, clearing of drainages, and so on. My office was merely coordinating because it was being executed by line ministries, 6 ministries to be exact. And it was executed And to the end, in that financial year, and about 300,000 jobs were created for the youth. But it was also a good lesson for us that bureaucracy can actually frustrate something that is very noble, because when it was audited, when we got information that there had been some indiscretion, we asked the Treasury to carry out an audit. This audit was carried out, and it was found out that there had been some double procurement in some ministries.
Mm-hmm. Please carry on, but just watch your time.
Yes. And the action was actually taken against the officers who were found to have been culpable. The World Bank also did an audit of this particular program. And the World Bank actually eventually gave it a clean bill of health and decided to continue with a component of it, which is right now being rolled out by the private sector. So it was actually a stimulus program aimed at cushioning the youth at the time when the economy was very bad. There was the drought, we had a post-election violence, and there was a world economic meltdown. And that's the reason why we introduced it. We have learned a lot of lessons from it.
Okay, so your time is up. I'll follow up, 30 seconds. The urban food subsidy program, which turned into the maize scandal. Could you clarify that, please?
The maize scandal, when we got information that there had been some indiscretion, I asked the officers who have been mentioned in my office, the permanent secretary and the chief of staff, to step down for investigations. I also suspended 2 ministers, but as you know that my action was countermanded. What I said was that these officers were investigated and only brought back after independent investigations were concluded.
Your time is up, but I will follow up because we see different treatment of ministers from you, double standards, so that you suspended ministers when it came to the maize scandal, but we've had recent controversies within the health ministry, and no minister has been suspended. How do you justify that?
There has really been no concrete evidence provided to show that there's been any kind of wrongdoing in the ministry financially. There have just been wild allegations and claims. If I had any concrete evidence that there was any indiscretion, I would not hesitate to suspend the minister and the permanent secretary. But this has not been the case.
Okay. Ms. Karua, you want to say something?
I just wanted to remind the Honorable Prime Minister that one gets suspended not because there is concrete evidence against you, to facilitate investigations. And therefore, in the case of the NHIF scandal, there was concrete evidence of irregular payments to health service providers.
You remember that the CEO of the ministry himself was actually suspended in that particular case, and even the board was also suspended.
But not the minister?
The minister, because the minister, there was no evidence linking the minister with what had happened in that particular corporation. If there had been, I would not have hesitated to suspend the minister to facilitate investigations.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Dida, I'll come to you. Again, personal economies, because you've told us, or you've told the media that you have an employment agency that sends workers to the Middle East. Is that correct?
It is an agency that it was meant to save the plights of Kenyan by sourcing employment.
Right. So I'll ask you the substantive question. As president, you're expected to create jobs in Kenya, but you have a personal business that outsources Kenyan labor, takes them to the Middle East where they work, presumably as domestics. And we've all seen, the images of, people and the way they're treated in the Middle East. Is this correct? Is this right?
Kenya is very rich in human resource, and the world is in need of this gift that God has blessed with Kenya. But one thing that failed the system, it is not, employment was not sourced only in the Middle East. We have, in the country, we have 57 employment agencies who source for employment all over the 5 continents. But all of us were frustrated because the country lacks legal infrastructure. It is the state It is the government that is to agree, have a memorandum of understanding with the other government on what a Kenyan should be paid, how the children, what will be the fate of the children, what will be the housing, medical, all this. So it was us following our problems. I worked for the government and had to leave because of funny salaries and because of very funny working conditions. Then when we came up with this idea, go to the Ministry of Labor, my returns every 4 months reached 0, 0, 0. When we went using our money and came back to report that things are hostile outside, we were told a commission will be formed, it will investigate. We are waiting up to this minute.
Okay, with respect, Mr. Dida, you haven't quite addressed my substantive question. Is it right for you as a president to be sending Kenyans abroad to work as domestics? Should you not be concentrating on creating jobs and strengthening the environment here?
We have to take advantage on any system or any opportunity that will save our current condition, within the country and outside the country, whichever avenue. And every year, the government makes billions of money following the Kenyans who sneaked out of this country. And when this was severally repeated, that it is not safe to work outside, it is not safe to work outside. As we speak, Kenyans are going. As we speak, they are going.
Your time is up. Mr. Kenyatta, a few years ago, there was a clerical or typing error. The newspapers report this in quotes that resulted in millions of shillings being lost within the budget that you presented to Parliament. Could you explain that?
Let me first begin by saying that there was no money lost. And even as the media has reported it, as you've correctly stated, it was an error. We acknowledged that particular error. The matter was investigated by both the Parliamentary Committee, the IMF, and also the Office of the Auditor General, and it was found to be precisely that, an error. I have never been accused of any kind of financial impropriety, and furthermore, as a result of that error, I did in fact take action of overseeing the re-engineering of the Integrated Financial Management Information System to include a budget module so that that error would not be repeated again in the future.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Kiapi, just this weekend in the newspapers, a court order directing you to pay over 700 million shillings to a supplier because his contract was improperly terminated. Could you address that, please?
Yes. When I went to the Ministry of Medical Services in September 2008, I found that my predecessor had signed that contract with a company called Dole International. And when I arrived, there was already investigation by the Anti-Corruption Commission because it was alleged that the procurement did not follow the law. So basically, as a new PS, I was briefed by the ministry officials that I could not approve that payment pending this investigation. And I was also equally advised by the Anti-Corruption Commission that it would be imprudent. So that's what I did. I basically said, let the investigation take their own course. And in the end, we went to the Public Accounts Committee, and I gave again the same submission. The issue was not me approving money, which I was not confident of. The issue was to be sure that the government or the public resources were spent correctly. And that was my role. In fact, if anything, I protected public resources. And I must be commended for that.
Thank you. Mr. Kenneth, there are questions about your wealth, in spite of the fact that you're the only MP who's paid taxes. And these questions stem from your previous life in private service. Could you address that, please?
Well, I only served in 2 places in public places. One was the Kenya Football Federation, where I was the national chairman. We had no funding from government at all, and the entire funding was coming from 3 corporate sponsors, Kenya Breweries, BAT, and SmithKline Beechams, and their own officers were signatories of any money spent for KFF together with our Secretary General. And when I left, we left an audited account and 11 million shillings in the bank. Second time I served as in a public office was at Kenya Insurance Corporation as managing director. All I did was to prepare the company to be stock listed. And today, is one of the best quoted companies in the stock exchange.
Okay, thank you very much. So very quickly, yes, Mr. Kiapi.
Udwak, I want to ask a question to the office of the Prime Minister.
Yes, go ahead, please.
And the Deputy Prime Minister, who was then Minister for Finance.
Go ahead.
When I went to the Ministry of Education, I was alleged to have presided over the loss of free primary education when it was obvious that I had just left the Ministry of Medical Services. And even though I tried to bring out to the public domain that I was just a new PS, and the reason I went there was actually to go and sort out the mess.
Your question, please.
The two officers, why did they fail to bring this matter to conclusion up to this point, to explain to the country what exactly happened, whether or not that money was lost?
Mr. Kenyatta, I'll start with you.
That matter was investigated, and in fact, it did reveal that a number of officers at the Ministry of Education were involved in irregular activities. There was also an issue on the other side of certain expenses that were not part of the program, but you could not necessarily tie impropriety to them. The report was completed and finalized even before I left the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Finance.
Right. Mr. Odinga, a chance to respond because you also asked the question.
To my knowledge, some officers in the Ministry of Education were actually prosecuted, and some of them actually sentenced to serve prison terms. So I'm very surprised that my brother is saying none of the officers was found to have been implicated. I did suspend the minister at that time because of some remarks he had made somewhere saying that he was rewarding people from his constituency with this money. So I'm saying we need to be able to take action when we find in this
Your time is up. Mr. Dida?
The policy,
sorry, I'll give Mr. Dida
generally was, if you can't beat this government and the corruption system and the cartels, you join them. That is why those who never liked it, there was no option. Kamlesh Patni, you mentioned, is a young man who confused everybody in this government. And he said, jail me, but we will go all of us, from the retired to the current in the system.
Okay, your time is up. Mr. Kiapi.
I just wanted to clarify that there were two issues. There was an earlier inquiry which forced the PS to be asked to step aside and which necessitated the extended forensic audit. And therefore, the one where officers were interdicted was the first one. This second one involved 4.2 billion Kenya shillings. And later on, it turned out that 2.3 billion Kenya shillings was just a reconciliation issue. And 1.9 billion shillings actually went to primary schools. And that's the one where I was being crucified.
Okay. Mr. Kenyatta, back to you.
Like I said, the issue was two parts. One, that we were able to prove actual impropriety, and action was taken against those officers. As Mr. Kiapi has said, there was also the issue of payments made that were not necessarily improper, but were irregular in accordance with the program. Then there was also the issue of reconciliation. That whole scenario was finished. I think what Honorable Kiapi is talking about is that maybe
your time is
there
up.
Was no public statement to say that he was not found to be culpable.
Right, your time is up. Mr. Odinga.
No, I sympathize with him that this happened, but it did not bring this to the notice of the office of the Prime Minister that was having these sort of problems. I would have actually ordered that his name be cleared. He did not. He's just raising it here now. All the times whenever I hear these kind of things, I take quick action.
Right. Thank you very much. Mr. Mwite.
Out of the 10 billion shillings, the budget error, you will trace 8 billion is actually in the Ministry of Education. Second point, perhaps calling for comment, is that while we say that no money was lost in the Ministry of Education, the British government demanded a refund of money that had been misappropriated. And we refunded from taxpayers' money.
Thank you, sir. Yes, Ms. Carroll.
I just thought that certain issues have not been raised. For my colleague, Honorable Mudavadi, his role in one of the leasing contracts. And for my colleague, Honorable Odinga, the issue of the molasses land. And for my friend, esteemed friend Peter Kenneth, the circumstances under which he came to own a house that belonged to Kenya Re. These are all in the public domain.
Thank you.
That's how come I know them.
Mr. Mudavadi, Ms. Karua has raised a point on Anglo leasing.
I want to state that clearly I have not been involved in any impropriety in government. And I want to state here that the issue that she's raising, which had to do with the telecommunications area, was a matter that was investigated and has been investigated. And this happened way back almost 10 years ago. And to date, I have answered all the questions that I have been asked regarding this particular issue. And I feel that I have been vindicated because
Your time is
up to date, I have not been charged for anything.
Mr. Odinga, the molasses saga.
Well, the molasses project was a project turned sour, a government corporation with a foreign company. It was then decided to be sold. It was put under receivership through Ernst Young. It was sold through an auction by a company. Spectre International bought it through an auction, and full price was paid for the plant, including that of land. So there was no corruption in that.
Thank you. Mr. Kenneth?
I never bought any house from KENYAN Insurance Corporation. I went to the PIC to actually give evidence as a friendly witness of a house that I bought that had been bought by somebody else from Kenya National Assurance. And I'm glad that Central Bank gave evidence to show that even the first buyer fully paid in his transaction with Kenya National. And those details are with Parliament.
Thank you. So these questions all relate to the leadership and integrity. Yes, Mr. Kenneth.
Yes, I had a question, but you didn't notice my hand.
Okay, please go ahead.
And this goes to my friend, Honorable Mudavadi.
Right.
And probably Honorable Moite, because he was in that committee.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm saying this because if my friend Professor Saitoti was alive, the details on especially Goldenberg would have been different. I just want to know the two big entries that constituted Goldenberg, that is the 5.9 and the 13.5, were paid in 1993, in April and August 1993, under your tenure. Under what circumstances? Because I think it's good for clarity as we try to reconcile ourselves with these things.
Mr. Mudavadi.
I think it's a situation where I'm being brought to talk about a situation where somebody is not available to defend themselves. But let me put it very clearly, and let God rest Professor Ito's soul in eternal peace. But let me put it very clearly. When I took over in the Goldenberg, in the Ministry of Finance, the Goldenberg scandal had already been identified. However, the details of it had not been done. And the transaction that he's talking about is the subject of a court case where the then permanent secretary, again deceased, Dr. Koinange, there was somebody else within the central bank who are involved in that transaction. That matter is in court, and I am a state witness on that particular matter.
Thank you. Mr. Mwite?
Well, I am even today the lawyer for Nazir Ibrahim Malish, the person to whom the bulk of the gold which we don't produce is supposed to have been exported. I can state confidently that no gold was ever exported. The compensation that was being paid for goods, gold. In fact, even diamonds are supposed to have been being exported. And it was all paperwork, being stamped, with nothing going. Happily, this is not a chapter which is closed. I have the information, Nazir Ibrahim has the information, and I'm sure that one day, those who took Goldenberg money will pay it back. And finally, when you look at the figures, and yes, God rest the soul of Saitoti in peace, but actually less in terms of amount was exported, or rather was defrauded when he was Minister of Finance than when my friend Mudavadi was actually Minister for Finance. Okay. About 75% was stolen when he was Minister.
Right. Mr. Odinga, you had your hand up.
Can I respond to that?
Sorry.
I don't think Honorable Paul Mwite knows what he's talking about, because I've stated here that there was a Price Waterhouse audit report that was produced. Secondly, it's on record and it's answered that in Parliament, I stopped further payments which had been recommended by the Public Accounts Committee, that further payments be made to Goldenberg. And I singly came out, moved a motion that blocked that payment of any further funds to Goldenberg. So I am very, very clear, and I stand here with a clean conscience, that I am the one who terminated Goldenberg, which had caused havoc to the economy of this country.
Mr. Odinga.
In 1997, we in the opposition then insisted that we will be allowed to appoint electoral commissioners so that we can have an electoral commission that is truly independent. At that time, my sister Martha Karua was with us. As Minister for Justice and Constitutional Affairs, we again demanded that when the terms of other commissioners expire, we be allowed also to appoint other commissioners. Her response was that, oh, that was a gentleman's agreement, IPP's gentleman's agreement, allowed the executive to single-handedly source the commissioners to the Electoral Commission, who were responsible for messing up the elections last time. That is a responsibility that she actually must carry, and actually she owes an explanation to the nation of Kenya.
Thank you. Ms. Karua.
Thank you very much for asking, for raising that issue. It is true that in IPPG, we had agreed during that time that the opposition shares appointments of the Electoral Commission. That sharing was to political parties. In 2007, parties had metamorphosed in Parliament, were not recognizable. Mr. Odinga was part of the NAC, original NAC. So they were basically members of the party in government, but they'd broken away to the Orange Democratic Movement born out of the referendum. So in a nutshell, there were no parties to consult except KANU, and KANU, mandated by the president, I consulted KANU through its then leader, Uhuru Kenyatta. But for the other parties, because we didn't have anybody to consult, we consulted members of parliament of each of the areas where we were appointing new commissioners. And I remember consulting with members from Nyanza and even talking to Honorable Raila at the back there in Parliament when I told them they could not just be given two, because he was asking me whether they could get two commissioners, because there was no party to give. So we consulted, and it's me personally who consulted members of Parliament virtually from each area. And that is why up to date, even if you look up through the newspapers, none of the commissioners is condemned by the members of their area because they had consented to their appointments.
Mr. Odinga.
I just want to jog the memory of my sister. NAC was a coalition. NAC was not a political party with individual membership. We were there, for example, like LDP. My sister belonged to the Democratic Party. There was Ford Kenya. There were several other parties in the NAC coalition. And we were there as members of the Liberal Democratic Party, which was a partner of the National Alliance Party of Kenya. She refused to recognize deliberately. She says not that the party did not exist. LDP existed, but she refused and just said this executive has the sole authority under the Constitution to appoint the Electoral Commission. So we were the player appointing the referee, and that is actually what ended up with the kind of mess that we ended up with in the country.
Just very briefly to say, the record is there for everybody to see. LDP did not have members in Parliament. Those are the parties that came together. Even DP had no members. We all became members of NAC. It is only in 2007 where, through an amendment to the Political Parties Act, we've been able to call ourselves NAC Kenya, while we entered through PNU. That arrangement was not there in 2001, and blaming the Electoral Commission for the mess when it is parties and their henchmen who rigged is trying to rewrite history.
Thank you. Mr. Dida.
Thank you for your sincerity pertaining your questions on integrity and leadership. But did you expect a thief to tell you I've stolen? And number two, pertaining the Electoral Commission and the mess. If things did not go right and the elections were rigged, was it wise for the honorable member, the Prime Minister, to accept the results and sign? If you are not happy, you involve the international, the UN, and it is the best way of doing it. When all that has happened, and then he accepts to partner with that government that he claims to have stolen, is he not guilty to bear everything that has happened? Mr.
Odinga?
Well, my brother lives in Kenya. I don't know whether he's just come in. You need to know that there was an intermediation by the international community, which ended up with signing of an accord to end the violence which was going on in the country. But it needs to be also put on record here that we did not go to the court because the judiciary was very partisan. All those judges had been appointed by one of the players. The Chief Justice was all the times robed, ready to go and swear in the president. So we did the best that we could do in the interest of peace in the country to compromise and agree to sign an accord that facilitated power sharing and made the country move forward.
Mr. Dida.
The idea by Kofi Annan was just a suggestion. Is it wise you agree and you sign, you are part of the government? A wise thing was, how do you accept? Where will peace come from? The dead are not yet buried. There are so many people who are displaced. And you are not, up to today, people just say it was stolen. The wise thing was, I will not accept these results. It has to be redone, and the international world has to be, I'm a Kenyan, I was born here.
Would you like to respond?
Witness.
The conditions for a repeat of elections did not exist at that time. There was a complete turmoil all over the country. So what we did was really in the best interest of the country, to sign for peace and move forward. This is what we did so that we could actually unite the country and hold on until the next elections. So we acted in the best interest of Kenya.
Thank you. Mr. Mudavadi.
Fine. I just wanted to point out one thing, but really I wanted to revert a little bit to the earlier debates, because it would be important for Paul Mwite, for instance, to also elaborate a little bit about the Thigiri Ridge investment, which caused a lot of stress within the National Bank of Kenya. I don't know whether he's resolved that. And I would like to know whether Peter Kenneth can tell us what his interest in Prudential Building Society was, and whether he's happy that it went down with a lot of depositors' money.
I was never an employee of Prudential Bank. You have to get your facts right, DPM. I was an employee of Prudential Bank, which was totally different from Prudential Building Society. I was not a director. I was not a shareholder. I have read that the shareholders and directors of Prudential Bank have been taken to court by Deposit Protection Fund.
Mr. Mwite.
It's part of the targeting that I was mentioning by a government in which he was a prominent member. They were targeting you at personal level, your economic base, your reputation, kila kitu. But being a lawyer, I am facing it. I have faced it. And you will hear resolution, Honorable Mudavadi. But permit me to mention separately that I had hoped the Prime Minister, apart from raising the issue of the Electoral Commission, perhaps would have given an opportunity to Honorable Mother Karua to comment on the blockage of a reform package that I had initiated as chair of the Committee on the Administration of Justice, and very supported very ably by the Prime Minister, the Honorable Uhuru Kenyatta, and other leaders. I discussed it with them. Because having lost the referendum in 2005, it was quite clear to us that the 2007 elections were going to be problematic without a minimum reform package targeted at making the elections free and fair.
Okay.
And as Minister for Justice, what role did she play in blocking that package?
Thank you. I think the word blockage should be used for them because I started as Justice Minister, a multi-sectoral forum that brought in all the political players, parties inside and outside Parliament, to discuss the way forward. We were actually ready to complete the constitutional review process, but Honorable Moite chairing the parliamentary committee and ganging up with those who had left government quickly punctured that effort and brought in his own package, which he wanted us to take as a medical prescription without discussion. It wasn't possible. Even a government has a voice, and that way it was completely impossible to complete the constitutional review process or to have his package, because his package was a must, not negotiable. So
thank you. Mr. Kenyatta, your name was mentioned. Mr. Moite mentioned you as part of the effort to block his reform package.
I don't think he said I was part of any attempt to block.
He said support.
He was,
he was supporting. I had breakfast with him in his house.
All right. My mistake.
He was supporting.
My mistake. Mr. Kenneth.
Yes. For a couple of minutes, the debate was basically between Dida, the Prime Minister, and Martha about the events of 2008.
Yeah.
And I would just like to ask, did it have to take us 60 days? Lots of loss of property, loss of life, people getting displaced, and then eventually on the 28th of February come to a conclusion and agree. Did it have to take that long? Couldn't we have looked for faster, easier methods to arbitrate if there was a dispute? And although yesterday we were at Uhuru Park and we pledged our peace and everything, I hope come next Monday we will not have a repeat, because it's a huge loss to our country and our people. It's not acceptable to go that route.
That certainly is the hope of every Kenyan, I believe, for peaceful elections, and that you'll all, pursue your disputes peacefully if you have any. But we've all touched on something, the disputes and how they affected the economy. And that has been the pattern of Kenya, that every election year the economy stalls because of the insecurity. We have ethnic clashes, but we also have the business environment and investors jittery. So I'll start with you, Mr. Kenneth. How would you ensure that the cycle of violence we have seen in Kenya, or that elections actually, let me rephrase the question, how would you ensure that elections in Kenya do not affect the economy?
I think the first thing is that we have to get our security right. And I can tell you this, for the last 4 years and 5, this economy has struggled. It's growing at its highest at 4.7, which means we can't even achieve Vision 2030. We can't create jobs. We are just about to simply stop going anywhere because the number of jobs that are being created are not enough for many young people who are coming out seeking employment. At the moment, we are only creating 35,000 jobs in the formal sector. We have 1 million Kenyans looking for jobs or coming out to look for jobs every year. Not, of course, to count that you have 5.4 million Kenyans who are not employed. Now, for me, security is very important. I think the independence of judiciary is very important so that arbitration really can be left to the institutions that are put in place. I also feel through the Constitution we have brought in some safety measures. The trigger in the last election was the swearing in. The second trigger was that we didn't think the judiciary could be able to arbitrate. Those are sorted out. I am worried about many young Kenyans who are unemployed and who could use any trigger to cause a dispute. And the only other way to do it is to depoliticize the civil service so that we know that the country can run with or without politicians. And that is why it is very, very important for us to ensure the institutions envisaged in the new constitutions are in place, empowered and working. Short of that, we'll still go to the 5-year cycle, which really hurts our economy.
Thank you. Mr. Kiapi, how would you ensure that elections in Kenya don't affect our economy negatively?
First of all, we need to change what drives leadership in Kenya. What drives leadership in Kenya is power and raw power, not really people empowerment. It's not leadership in the sense of leadership. What I would like to do is to make sure that we give power back to the people. That's what democracy is all about.
So that's what the Constitution says.
We empower the citizens by making sure when we go to elections, there will be no rigging because the citizens are speaking. The truth must begin there. Number two, we must make sure the institutions that manage these processes, the IEBC and the judiciary and all the institutions involved, including the security institutions, are given the tools and empowerment, but there is no manipulation. If you set an election and create a power interest and frame them almost like you frame an election to fail, then we have a problem. So I would like us to shift away from election or from leadership that is about intrigues, it's about power, it's about interest, to an election about empowering people in terms of economy, in terms of education for our children, in terms of security, in terms of Kenya's position and international markets. It's about Vision 2030, and it is leadership. Like the American President Bill Clinton once said, he looked at the American situation and he said, the economy is stupid. In Kenya, it is leadership stupid. We've got to fix the leadership. If we do it, there is no problem with Kenya. And I would personally demonstrate it if given to become president. It is this unselfish leadership that is needed. And it is Kenyans who can only do that. Because I can't, none of us here can elect themselves as president. It is the citizens who will make up their minds. And they have to do what the prophet told us yesterday. We cannot go round and round and round. We have to break away from that and take bold decisions.
Thank you. Mr. Kenyatta, between now and 2013, we have about 17 years and therefore about 3 more elections. But Vision 2030 asks us to attain double-digit growth. How would you do that given the cycle of negative growth around elections?
I think the first and most important thing to recognize is that we now have a new constitution. And a lot of things are very clearly stipulated in that constitution. For example, one of the biggest issues has always been around the independence or the transparency around the Electoral Commission. We now have an independent Electoral Commission that has been appointed through an inclusive process that has been established. We have a judiciary that has equally been appointed through a transparent, open process. There is no reason whatsoever for any leader, for any political party, to call for mass action going forward because we now have institutions that are transparent. I think that goes a long way. The second issue is the issue of using ethnic animosity in elections. I think the Constitution is very clear. We have several commissions now that are in place to ensure that the issue of hate speech and such don't apply. We also have what we call now the reformed public service, where people will be applying for interviews. And as my colleague has said, we will now have an administration in place that can operate outside of the political arena and independently and move the country along. I think the strengthening of these institutions is going to go a long way towards ensuring that elections now become an event every 5 years, but not an event that destabilizes the economy. And going forward, I do believe that with a peaceful election this time round, next Monday, I am confident that our investors, our business people, will be able to say that Kenya has come of age and is now able to handle their elections in a non-violent manner, and for us all to accept the results as they come out and the nation moves forward.
Thank you. Mr. Odinga, how much responsibility do you accept for stalled economic growth? Because, of course, you've run for president before, and we've had insecurity around elections that you've participated in.
Well, as you know that we have really been moving forward, getting Kenya from a banana republic to what it should be. Now, we now have developed a new constitution through a very elaborate process. So by faithfully implementing the constitution, we'll be able to create proper institutions of governance in the country that will inspire confidence in this governance. And as far as electioneering is concerned, it actually depends on the players first, the political parties, which need to be national, and also the way that they actually conduct themselves, so that you actually do not divide the people along ethnic lines or inside them, that nobody will come up and flaunt ethnic figures and say that this bloc plus this bloc has got this percentage, so this election has already been won.
So you accept no responsibility for past insecurity?
Yes, and the other one is, of course, the institutions. The Electoral Commission need to be above board, and also other security agencies, because last time we had a situation where the police themselves were very much involved in the process of interfering with elections. The provincial administration as an institution was used very extensively to try to blackmail people to vote along certain lines. So once we have carried out also the transformation of the public service, then we will be able to inspire confidence, not only in our people, but in the foreigners who live here, so that investors can continue to invest even during the period of electioneering.
Ms. Karua, how would you address this, given that in the last week we have had the Chief Justice of the country claiming that his life is being threatened?
Let me say that first is to invest in the social development of our people. That is why we are always talking about civic education. Our people who have information are unlikely to be manipulated. We as leaders manipulate the people to fight, yet our children are never in the front line of those fights. It's other people's children we use. So helping people to realize that violence is not an option. The other thing is respect and strengthening of our institutions. I have seen leaders who are on this podium assailing the confidence in our institutions, whether it is the security institutions and others, by their utterances. Right now on this podium, we are talking about the defunct Electoral Commission. Although we know that it is political parties and their agents who recruit people to rig elections, no Electoral Commission can be totally nonpartisan. The Kenyan one, the process we adopted in Parliament, the committee that selected the names was from the Prime Minister's office and the President's office. I can stand here and say they are partisan, but as Kenyans, we have to give each other a chance. There are many checks and balances against an institution rigging, and for me, I'm putting my faith and trust in them, urging my supporters to help. Let us all help to have credible institutions. The last one, justice system. We must make sure that the prosecutions, the investigations are reformed, and we must make sure perpetrators of violence are punished to deter others from following that course.
Thank you. Mr. Dida?
About elections and economy.
Actually, the question is, how do you stop elections in Kenya from being synonymous with stalled economic growth?
We love money. The young, the old, all of us. And the mistake we did is there is a lot of money up there. The only solution is we bring it to normalcy. If we say the president of this country will earn 100,000 and a lecturer in the university will get 120, with all these responsibilities, nobody will go. You just look at what am I supposed to do, what is the pay, and if we agree and work on that, nobody will. I asked so many councillors, county reps, when they were coming for certificates, why do you want to be a county rep? And you can serve Kenya in a better. They were saying, "Ujasikia mshahara ni 300,000." I don't know who will say this. So the only way is we reduce that madness in payment. Let it be normal. And in Europe and the developed countries, you will see somebody with a master's just going for a just manual shop, arranging boxes in a supermarket because it pays better. The other thing is we need to have spiritual leaders. Jesus Christ is a role model. He is a leader who will ensure that everybody has eaten before he eats. Jesus could not be driven home with a convoy of 6 vehicles while it is raining on innocent Kenyans at the stage. If Jesus was a leader, he could not crown himself. The Remuneration Commission will say, we have proposed 1.75 for the president, and then you want to be the president, and then you laugh. Yeah, it's good, it's good. No, you refuse. Where will this money come from? This money will be collected from the ordinary Kenyans who have problems with the rent, with the transport, with all these things. So we need to reduce that madness. Number two, we also want to have leaders who serve humanity.
Mr. Mudavadi, how would you address stalled economic growth whenever we have elections in Kenya?
Well, elections must always be seen as an event, and now it's guaranteed, and the date is very clear within our constitution. So we should not have any more doubts around that. But I think, let's face the reality. What may be happening about slowing down of economic growth is not unique to Kenya. This does happen even in the developed economies. Once in a while, when there's a cycle of election, because there's the question of who is going to be there, what policies are they going to stand for, what policies are they going to bring out, this definitely creates some measure of concern and reservation within investors, and sometimes they hold back. Now, as we move forward, I think we will need to strengthen a few things. One, our political parties will have to be strengthened so that they become more policy-oriented, rather than dealing with either tribal orientation or personality cults. This is one thing that needs to come out very, very clearly. The other thing that we would need to work on is to complete the legislation around elections. We have not done that. We have not completed the campaign funding legislation. Now, this brings in another issue, because the question is, people get worried and say, what is going to happen within this government system if there are no checks and balances? Are they going to loosen their guard and mess up with the economy? And all these are issues that come up when one is getting towards an election. But I can tell you, we have started the right process. We then have to follow the law strictly. We have to be disciplined ourselves as politicians. The electorate must also be disciplined and be able to know that it's a process where they determine their leadership, and after they've determined their leadership, they are supposed to go on with their work. But clearly, if Kenya or any other country was about to elect an Idi Amin or somebody like that, the reality would be that there would be uncertainty in the eyes of the investors. So there's need for scrutiny of all candidates as we move along.
Your time is up. Mr. Mwite?
I believe that the slowdown stems from uncertainties. Businesses, investors feel uncertain. Is there going to be violence? What is going to happen? Uncertainties. And if elections are free and fair, and seen to be free and fair, if elections are fought on the basis of issues, economic issues, interest rates, things like those ones, I believe those uncertainties will be a thing of the past. Ultimately, apart from elections being free and fair, we need to address the core issues which give rise to it, the root causes, which are the poverty levels, ethnic mobilization, the land issue. When these are addressed and solutions found, then elections will just be an event, and investors will not need to harbor any uncertainties. But there is a lot to celebrate in Kenya. We've come a long way. I like the way that people have been sensitized about there not being any need to lose any Kenyan life. I believe there is not going to be any violence. Any person who is going to lose the elections will go to the courts. But the earliest signs should be addressed. For example, there are still people who moved in other people's houses, people from a particular community, moved into houses built by members of another community.